Dear audience, dear guests in the front row and wherever you are, dear students and colleagues, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Together with you, we would like to think and discuss about some of the most important relations architecture has. That is, for us today, architecture in relation to the city, to landscape, to science and to art. Of course, while thinking about relations, we are already realizing relations. As a starting point, you could say we are realizing those relations between the five of us who have prepared this event. This is Christoph Heinemann, Professor of Architecture and the City. Christoph, would you just give a sign? Antje Stockmann, Professor of Architecture and Landscape. Matthias Ballestrem, Professor of Architecture and Experiment. And me, I'm responsible for Architecture and Art here at the HCU, and I'm very happy to do the introduction today. So I have to get some thanks to you. First of all, of course, I said five. And I just mentioned four persons because there's missing one important. Sarah Lucic Alavanya, please get up. She helped us with the preparation and the organization of the event. I think it wouldn't have happened without her. Thank you so much for the great job you've done, from all of us, I think. Of course, and very importantly, I want to thank the students from Seminar 001 and our tutors for setting up this collective space this morning. We tried to prepare the place in a more dialogical or in a multi-logical way. I hope you recognize it. I'm very proud and thankful to the students, and it was a lot of fun to do this morning, really. So also, thank you very much to our neighbor, the HafenCity GmbH, for the fundamental support. Fundamental support means financial support. And also, thank you so much to the graphic and web designers, Laszlo and Joshua, who have done this one and the one you can see here, the poster. The poster will help me with the conceptual narrative, because I was meditating about the typographical trick of the poster, which extends the L, as you can see here, but also here completely. And my first association was with a chewing gum that is stuck in your shoe. And the moment you lift your foot, and there's produced this white vertical line that connects you to the ground. Arguably, all relations are material. They are existing between things. So they don't belong to one thing or the other, but they are located in between. Just like the L on the poster, that neither belongs to the upper part, to the RE, nor to the bottom part. Relations do not belong to one or the other thing. They connect and they span between things. While scrolling the website, let me do this here, I was wondering how long the L could actually become. Let's say long from here to Syria. Would this connection be forgot because it's so long? A relation connects one thing to the other, but it also distances one thing from the other. It glues and it unglues. What goes on here has always effects there, and vice versa, even though we don't recognize these movements quite often. This is, of course, the current trivial and complex global condition It's also a wiki how to remove your gum from a shoe in 7 different ways, and there are videos telling you how to do this. So let's say this relational letter L was an O. Would we circulate between the lines? To read between the lines has a lot to do with relations. Not just because relations are necessarily completed in a common space that is most often the city, and perhaps also originally the city. To read between the lines has also to do with relations, because the notion addresses absence and presence at the same time. For example, the presence of the past in architecture's relation to history. You might remember the first biennial in Venice called The Presence of the Past. By definition, the past is absent from the present, of course. So the past has to be reconstructed every time we're referring to the past. And with this reconstruction, we also reconstruct the discipline architecture. And it's just an example. You might address this relation and identification to different fields. And every time you're setting up, you're constructing a relation, you're also constructing architecture. The L has become a line of flight between points of departure and arrival. These points or subjects or objects or disciplines are interconnected. They might share felt similarity or empathy, or they might even establish a complicity, like architecture and capital. By contrast, it might also be an apple and a pear that are brought together and then have to manage exchange and communication between them. In this case, the L produces a crisis, a slip on the poster, and a shock in relating to others. The shock results not just from recognizing that there are different positions out there. The shock is that there are unequal relations. Unsymmetrical love, for example. And Edouard Glissant, recalling a Romanian house where portraits of communist leader Ceausescu had been replaced by photographs cut from magazines of characters in the television series Dallas. For all of us who are too young for Dallas, you can Google it, and you will also recognize that Ceausescu and GR, who was the protagonist, have quite similar looks. Finally, and in terms of architecture, I stared at the L on the poster as if it was a representation of a wall on an architectural plan. As a wall, the L seems ordinary and neutral. We know it is not. The wall is part of a social, political, cultural complex that shapes our relation in a most literal way. The wall is employed first to divide and then selectively to reunite inhabited space. The wall might be the first relational object that humans have produced. From the very beginning, it has been a medium to establish social space where encounters, conversations, meanings, narratives, histories are produced and collectively set into motion. Today, this motion allows that the very concept of what is an architecture practice may be expanded from making objects to experimenting with structures and processes, or enabling gatherings or doing substantial research. In this sense, relations, rather than one or the other thing, gain importance and attention. That's why we're doing this here. This attention might, if you will, help us overcome the disciplinary specializations and expertise imposed by the political economy. It might be directed to the city, to landscape, to science and art, in order to evolve architecture as a relational project. As such a relational project, architecture is connected to our social, political, aesthetic, and environmental imaginary. What is possible and impossible, visible and invisible, finally, what is to be done. So let's start with architecture and landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona, and we will now start our first of our 4 sessions today on the topic of the relation between architecture and landscape. My name is Antje Stockmann, and I'm a professor of architecture and landscape, and I would like to discuss how in the age of the Anthropocene we can really think and design the connection between the built and the natural spheres that we're actually living in. And we are doing that also in the debate of the context of imagining we are living in the Anthropocene, which is a term that is much debated on lately, which also for us as designers, I believe, puts us in a new role. As this term of the Anthropocene, I don't know who of you already heard of it. It means that human activities are comparable to actually what we formerly believed were forces of nature. That we as humans become geomorphologic agents, that we can change the climates, that we transport more materials in the whole world than what is transported through sediment flows by rivers or through earthquakes. Which also means that our actions can be considered as forces of nature, while at the same time the forces of nature that we always thought of as being external to humans, they are heavily influenced by our actions. And therefore, as designers, we need to really reflect what that means, and we need to question our understanding of the pre-assumed difference between forces of nature and our actions of culture that we always thought of as 2 different spheres. And that we always thought of a distinguishment between architecture being something that is built by humans and natural being something that is without the influence of humans. And also we even need to question the concept of the European city, because in his statement on the culture of the European city, the German sociologist Walter Siebel emphasizes that the city begins as an act of liberation from the forces of nature. Is architecture really an act of liberation from the forces of nature, or is it something where we put ourselves in a new kind of relation? And this is what we would like to discuss in this session, and this is also the reason why we invited our 2 guests today. And both of them are practitioners. Both of them are also landscape architects, just as I am also a landscape architect. And through their reflections, we want to discuss how to imagine and also design new forms of interconnectivity, of interaction and hybridity between built and natural forms, and how this could reveal also new ways of maybe relations and coexistence between what we maybe thought of as different spheres. And as our first speaker, I would like to introduce Jenny Olsson from Oslo. She's a landscape architect and one of the 6 partners of the firm Snøhetta. When you look at the website of Snøhetta, you find that one of the main statements is that within the office, they talk about a definite relationship between multiple disciplines as a driving force of Snøhetta's work. And Jenny, being a landscape architect, works closely from the very initial stages of a design concept in an architecture strategy together with her colleagues from other disciplines, especially architecture. And many of you may know buildings like, for example, the Opera House in Oslo. And Snøhetta has grown internationally, has in the meantime different studios in Oslo and in New York, USA, and more than 180 employees. And so we are looking forward, Jenny, to your reflections on how you, as a landscape architect, a partner in your office, how you perceive about the relation between architecture and landscape.
Thank you, Antje, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm going to talk about relations. And this is actually Snøhetta the mountain, 2,286 meters. It's in the middle of Norway, and it's really about a relation between this mountain, the landscape, and an architect office. Because the first office was actually on top on a very brown bar that is called Dovrehallen, which is the area where this is on the top. So we named after a landscape and also after a brown bar. We have offices around the world. This is also about relations, that we would like to call ourselves very national and work all around the globe. And we usually want to climb our mountain, but last year we went to Innsbruck, to our office, and find another mountain. And then we have relations and discussions all together. We were just 120 of the 220 employees we are today. We started with landscape architects and architects from the beginning. It's interior architects, graphic designers, and artists, and 1.5 engineer in the office. This is our office in Oslo. It's one open space, 1,600 square meters. It's all about how we relate to each other. It's really the team that decides the project. So this is one day at the office, walking around all over. Of course, what is missing is the coffee machine, because we know that that's where most of the discussions are. And also this about to be interdisciplinary, we also call something transpositioning. That's actually to discuss and maybe have another role that you usually have. That a landscape architect could be the economist, or the economist and artist, how we actually relate and have ownership in a project. This actually started that researcher from the Technical University in Trondheim, they asked us if we would be part of a research how ID works. We were the sort of only creative profession, together with Statoil, the big oil company, a lawyer firm, a bank, and a magazine. And they found that all these firms actually had drivers to work with creative work, with ideas. And some of them, they found 10 drivers. Prototyping, it's very easy to understand for an architect. We need to make models and get physical. And my favorite one is liberating laughter. You need to have fun together. And then, of course, creative resistance. You don't really always need to agree. And I think that's important in relations, that it doesn't always have to be the same. Maybe you can push it much further if you have different opinions. And then we say punk production, really taking risks and really push projects much further. So this actually we put into a system when we have workshops with our clients, when we then transpositioning each other to actually say that we're in the green zone, there's no bad ideas, and you ask different questions if you have another position that you usually have in your profession. So we use pictograms and we actually make models in a short workshop in 3 hours to try to actually catch a new concept. So I need to show a couple of projects, so this will almost be like speed dating Snøhetta to show a couple of projects. So natural processes and architecture, how can that relate together? Going to Oslo, downtown Oslo, where so many cities around the world, it was actually a heavy road with heavy traffic, was actually cut off the sea and how to get to the nature. It's still nature when you have the sea, even if it's extremely cultivated. So the National Opera and Ballet in Oslo was a big quarrel for 20 years to actually make an opera, because a lot of Norwegians don't think that's necessary, because who cares about opera? But in the end, with all the oil money, they decided to make a competition, and we actually won. This was in 2000, and that was really about relating back to the city grid and the green the green hill that's called Ekeberg around, and we really wanted to slope it down into the ocean, and only the theater tower was the only thing that should stick out. So we thought this relation to the landscape in the city was really important. And we knew a lot of people didn't care about opera, so we said if you don't want to go into the opera, you should be able to walk on top of the opera. That's why we actually created the fifth facade as the public space. And we wanted to make it very different, a white building. And then to find the right materiality, went to Italy to have a marble, the Carrara marble, the opera marble, to try to make this new landscape that actually is a roof that again you can walk on top of and can be part of a landscape. It's a sloping plane that goes into the ocean, which always, of course, the horizon changing when you walk on top of it. And it needs also to survive during winter. It can be pretty cold winters with a lot of ice. And then the relation between indoor and outdoor was extremely important for us, to make people catch them to see what's indoors. And Norwegian, we love to go hiking, so we're always out walking. And then to make a plane that is open 24/7 for everybody, that they absolutely didn't ask for in the program for the architectural theater. And so it's an open space that can catch a lot of people with outdoor concerts. The historical one was when Justin Bieber were there, with 8,000 screaming young girls. But of course, it's really important that we have actually made a notion of making this new landscape a place you can walk, and there is actually opera and ballet inside it. So it creates, is it a landscape? Is it an object? Is it architecture? And it's really part of the city. A totally different way of looking into the landscape. It's moving to Lund, that in southern Sweden. It's they're making a science park with a synchrotron. It's part of Lund University. It has this amazing patchwork of agricultural land, and it's in the northeastern corner. What they discovered when they was making this synchrotron, that it was heavy traffic on one side, which actually created vibrations in the ground. And when you work with a synchrotron, it actually needs to be super stable. So vibrations in the ground would ruin the research laboratory. So for this surface thing, they said that actually we need to do something with the surface. They say the flatter, the more of the vibrations go down. And we were working with traditional landscape architecture. Cut and fill should go with 0. All the water ruffers should be kept on the site. And then we have the new parameter with the vibrations in the ground. So they said that actually the vibrations was from 10 to 40 meter long waves. And we thought it was a fantastic parameter to work with in parametric design. It's a lot of cut on the site, so we need to reuse that and not take it off the site. And we have a big, this is a flat surface, we had a big circle, all the light is taken out in tangents. So we said that one set of the parameter will be from the tangents to make new waves in the landscape that are 10 to 40 meter, and another set would be a spiral, because the researchers say the more chaos in the top of the surface, the better. So that's how we transform it. The 10-meter waves are closest to the ring, and the 40-meter are farthest apart. We could take actually the Rhino model straight into the GPS on the bulldozer, and you see me, they're really happy driving a bulldozer to then do the excavation in one turn, make it on site, and start to actually make a new landscape. And this landscape was evolving. Now we start to see actually the building as well, how it actually then all turned to a totally different landscape and actually had this hilly landscape. And then, of course, what to put on top. This was a monoculture agricultural landscape, and we said we wanted to look into what used to be there. And the meadow landscape, this is like the food chamber of the Nordic countries, because it's very good soil. So we found that the meadow land with the meadow plants was what used to be there. 80% of this meadow land has been reduced because of the agriculture landscape. So we found a natural reserve just 5 kilometers away, could cut the hay, spread it over on the new hills on the top. Actually, the amplitude is 4.5 meters. Then we go in 0 with all the mass balance. So this opened 2016, and last year the CEO sent this picture and said, it's fantastic. We have all this new meadow landscape. We have a lot of wildlife, and actually the reduction of the vibration is reduced with 30%. So we got sort of a natural landscape, well, how it used to be, into a science park. We know that the tools we are using in architecture is really important, and we can make new forms that we hardly could have done like 10 or 20 years ago. So to work with all these sort of natural shapes in a different way, to put that into like a rhino mold. This is for the Wild Reindeer Center that we worked with, and how to really use analog and digital processes at the same time. We even have an industrial robot in the office, so we do our carving of the models, and then sent the file over to actually a boat builders on the west coast of Norway. This is pine wood. It's local pine wood, 20 by 20 centimeters. It's made in a traditional ways. No screws, no glue, no nails, no nothing. It's just sat on the top of each other, and then just brought to the site in a frame, because this is an observation center that you actually look at Snøhetta. So then you have the interior and the exterior at the same time. So you have a shelter, you look at actually a natural reserve that used to be a military area. So it's absolutely not a pristine nature, but you're trying to get it back to be actually wild again. And then of course all the wild animals can then be on the outside and look at the strange creatures at indoors. So the wild reindeers, they have this very strange story about that after the ice age 10,000 years ago, they started to follow the snow when it was melting, and they kept on walking all the way to Norway. I don't know, understand why they didn't stay in southern Europe, because they're actually found in the cave paintings in Lascaux, and that's about humans and landscapes. For a very, very long time we had this relation. So back in Montagnac, in Lascaux, you probably maybe know about these cave paintings, 18,000 years old, and we were part of a competition in this area. They were found in the 1940s, and actually they were really, really special, that they were found by a guy that was out with his dog, and suddenly the dog went away, and he captured that it fell down where a tree was lost, and you can see that the section is actually where the cave is, and then we made the new center to make again a landscape part of a building. That we made 3 slots in the landscape. The first one is actually vertical, and the 2 next one are horizontal, to actually make sort of a new cave. So this landscape then turned into a new transformation, and the way you can say you go into a cave, but you sort of go in and you go out in the landscape, and you go inside the cave and you get the light. The cave paintings are a restoration. It's 25 artists that worked for 2 years to restore it, and now it's part of the new cave museum, that you're indoor and outdoor, and it relates back to the landscape that actually then has been people using sort of architecture and worked with art the last 18,000 years. And I think that's probably where I'm gonna stop right now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jenny, for showing how you, from your mindset as a landscape architect, how you do your projects, and we will get into the discussion about that later. But before, we would like to ask Martí, French, but Lori from Spain, to also give us a short impression of his works. Martí, he's the founder and the principal of EMF Landscape Architecture. And EMF is also an interdisciplinary practice, a landscape architecture practice, working and practicing internationally, and also exploring hybrid ways to build connections between ecological systems and cultural constructs. And in this way also build new relationships. Marty was also awarded different awards for his projects, and he will show and explain today how he builds his relations based on the projects that he is doing in his firm. And Marty, we would like to invite you to give us an impression.
Thank you. I'm having to excuse because I'm coming from Barcelona, and Barcelona and Catalonia is having a very hard time. I don't feel I come from Spain, and I'm gonna steal you 2 minutes to talk about asymmetric relations, as you mentioned about before. This is my city, Barcelona, and these are 6 demonstrations that happen every 11 September. It's our national day. For 6 years, an average of 17% of the population of Catalonia has gone in the streets to ask some democratic changes, which I don't want to discuss, which is independence, but that's not the point. We have a radical hope to do things differently. If you ever would have 17% of the population of Germany demonstrating in Berlin, that would make, 17% of the population, 14 million people demonstrating in Berlin. If you ever would have 6 years in a row, 14 million of people demonstrating in Berlin, perhaps something would happen. What happens at home is the first half of the people that have done absolutely not any violent act are in prison for promoting a referendum. And then, sorry, the ones on top, yes, the ones on top are in prison, and the ones on the bottom, the darker gray, are in different countries. The first one is President Puigdemont, who is now in Berlin, you know, I'm sure, and he's the mayor of my town, who used to be the mayor of my town. Okay, not only this is going on in Spain, that people who don't think according to the constitution, you may be going to jail, but also, for instance, in the art festive fair in Madrid, which is Arco, the most important art fair in Madrid, an art piece that was making photographics of the people in prison was removed. And this is very demonstrating of a spirit of the moment. But I want to me, the most radical thing is that also is how journals treat that. You may know El País has one of the reference journals in Spain of the left wing. The way El País wrote about that was almost neglecting it. Say, this art piece was retired from the art exhibition because they talk about prisoners. The other newspaper, which is as well a newspaper from Madrid, talks directly about censura. I don't know how you call that, but it's really banned. Okay? A book that talks about drug dealing in Galicia, not in Catalonia, in Galicia, has been removed from the bookshops because some people from the right wing don't like what this says. This book, it's really going to the libraries and it's being unpublished. And these are 3 different rap bands that they're gonna go into jail because their lyrics, they don't please the politics. Okay? So to me, it's incredibly violent when I tour in Europe now, because I feel that what's going on in our country, it's completely unfair. But what is more violent is that, in fact, the way what happens there, it's completely manipulated by press. That's my feeling, but most of the press. So what your impression of what's going on here, what German has done by last week has give a lot of breath, because we have the feeling that here there's an independence between the justice and the political. But the situation down south, it's very tough. Next Monday, we're gonna make a demonstration because there are 2 activists, not politics, they have been in prison for 6 months now. This demonstration has hardly been in media, because if anybody puts their name organizing this demonstration, they're gonna be judged as terrorists. Yesterday, 2 girls were taken into the Spanish court in Madrid, not in Barcelona, in Madrid, because organizing protest acts, okay? They cut the motorway, but they are not gonna be judged for doing a vandalist act. they are going to be judged as terrorists, which means that the years you can spend in prison are much more. And this is supported by almost all the parliament in Spain, including the Labour Party, right? It's just that bad is the situation. So sorry, I need to take this. Now I know I lose part of the time. I would like to talk about much smaller practice. This is my Mediterranean landscape. We as practice, we are a cocktail already. So it's 60% landscape architects, 40% architects, 20% horticulturalists, 20% biologists. That makes 140%. It's because some of us, we get a double degree. And we also design cocktails. So I'm just analyzing this photography there. I think it's 65% of this project. It's about walkography or a sequence of moving through the landscape without changing it, just finding a way to explore in this landscape. 15% is about differentiated management, the way of pruning vegetation, the way of opening. 10% is about subtraction. That rock there was partially covered, and this is a kind of a lens. This architectural object, it's a fence that takes you to a place for you to look at the fossils. So this is this 10% of architecture. Now, I think that we landscape architects and architects, so I don't care about I'm definitely for a relational design, but I think there is some value in also what we share and what we do not share, or what are our expertise. So we definitely share space, but the way or our funding ingredients of what we design, the nature of them, are not precisely the same in my eyes. So they are not seemingly alive. The basic of architectural design, it's much more inert, whereas the one of landscape is completely alive. And also the degree of control that brings that, it's very different. So as a landscape architect, you can't really pretend to control certain facets of the design. It's completely, you can play with it, but you won't control it. Okay, so I'm just gonna try to read this piece of text, which is not mine, and I just find it 2 days ago, and I really like this. And he says, what is not drawn? He says, and talks about his beautiful drawings on plantings. He says, these drawings do not show which plant is short-lived and which is robust. They do not show how one plant conforms the other, or what the selected perennials are not competitive. They do not show maintenance requirements. They do not show movement of the wind or growth over a season or over years. They do not show the gradual exposure of skeleton stems or the persistence of strong textures after flowers die away. They do not explore transparency or how light transforms foliage and how foliage transforms space. These are not drawn here, but they are known. I mean that the expertise in designing with living or alive ingredients has a lot of things that you play with them, but you don't really control the final. And this is, so the degree, because you design with cycles, processes, and a high degree of uncertainty, maybe the way of designing them or thinking about them, it's different. And maybe the only thing, it's more about the structural performance of the design at the end. And then, that's an intuition. I'm not an academic, so I'm not very confident about that. But Dirk Simons, a landscape architect in the Netherlands, says that the space itself, it's a temporal perception. Okay, and you can see in these two drawings that in a more natural area, in 30 years, a landscape can be completely transformed. But also in an urban context, over a period of 30 years, a landscape can be completely transformed, 100% of the surface. This makes me think about landscapes like living organisms, that they are in transient conditions, they are constantly changing. And then in the sense, for instance, of public space or a city, only those spaces that they are capable to adapt, they perform, they are productive, in a very broad sense of the term productive. And then I found out this beautiful reflection by Richard Sennett that completely get me traumatized, because he said that this is a project I hate in Barcelona from the Olympic Games. I think it's completely dead, this project. It's terrible. It was always terrible, actually. But he says that overdetermination both of the city's visual forms and its social functions have a similar dinosaur effect. And that makes me think about how many of the projects we did in my practice are really dinosaurs. So how many of the projects I've produced, it has actually the capacity to adapt over time and advance in time. And then himself, Richard Stennett as well, talks about the notion of evolutionary time and perhaps this idea of not wanting to define everything right from the beginning of the project. So my question, and it's not an answer, it's a question, is if we architects and landscape architects share the same times in projects. So Patrick Arecheren, a very good French architect and a friend of mine, did the upper architecture and I did the lower one. So I put the water so we get the much cheaper version of the buildings, but you never know. And you also probably know about this relation that comes from Nicolas Bourriot, the French art critic, but also I discovered through Lisa Diederich, the German landscape architect or urbanist. And it's this comparison about the modern architecture and the way that it's fixed in a radical way, so you cannot change a tree, the roots are there and they don't move, whereas a randican or an ivy or a climber, it keeps producing roots as it grows. So it has this capacity to somehow adapt. And that makes me think about this concept of, since we are working with alive places and landscapes, we really face a lot of uncertainty. Perhaps we should focus, when thinking about the temporal dimension of our designs, about the responsibility. So I think I have many other slides to show, but I think I'm going to stop here. I just want to comment on this drawing. This is part of a kind of a PhD I started, and then I'm in a standby moment. This is how I think most of the architectural projects are done, including the ones that we do as well in practice, is that the red would mean the conceptual part, the green would be the building part, the arrows that go up is the relations with clients and the clients from you, and then maybe the site visits. I have the impression that most of the public spaces, but also buildings, are done in the practices in a very abstract environment, in a closed atmosphere, and there's a lot of energy put in there, and most of it is decided in that moment. Then you send it to the client gives some inputs or not, and then there's a bit more of a readjusting of that, and then all this technical nightmare, via crucis of talking with everybody, and then it gets built. And then you deliver to someone else and you ask to keep it as similar as it is, no? And I'm thinking about for instance, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. It needs to be like this. It's just, and this is another project that I won't show because I don't have time, but it's a project about management. It's a project about a bit, the gardening movement, the concept of Gilles Clement, where we did a bit of reflection, not too much, and then we could do a little action. This little action was in a green area next to the city, opening a riverscape by just cutting branches and recovering a sand beach. But then we saw the results, and then I'm going to show. This is the image. And then we could react upon that. So this could be one of the parts where we test this model that has to do with management, it has to do with doing a number of operations through the year, and it has to do with recovering heritage around my city. So if I go back, it was a place where it was a no place. Nobody would go there. It's the back of the city and the back of nature. Then by putting attention into this place, the people who take care of these areas would go there with a mower, or like if they would be goats or sheep, and they would cut it everything. So eventually you could start working on that, okay? But this was done without any spatial intelligence. It was just flattened down, like if it would be animals. And then in that is where we start thinking if the management, the action of management, not the action of totally transformation, the act that it repeats every 3 months or every 6 months can really design a place. That's what we did. But then we didn't have the money, for instance, to put some sitting areas or to make the paths better. So my idea about is this idea that perhaps, and I'm going back to, and I'm finished with this idea that perhaps the way we, both architects and landscape architects, would be good that we don't do things at once, that we have this possibility to go back to a place and to rethink it. The same way when you move to an apartment, you don't buy all the furniture. You stay a bit, and then you study the windows and the light, and then you do it little by little. That would be a bit my point. Thank you.
So, the relations between architecture and landscape. I think, Marty, you used a nice image of we are cocktails and we design cocktails, and also Jenny, you started your talk with showing how you actually work together within the office in this complex diagram. And I would be interested, because also here at HafenCity University we talk a lot about interdisciplinarity. I'm also teaching as a landscape architect in the programs of architecture, urban planning, engineering. So it's about these different views and how do they come together, and how do you then, within a collaborative working environment, how do these different perspectives come together in the process of the conceptual design idea? Maybe, Jenny, when you showed this diagram of everybody talking basically to everybody in a complex network, what's your role as a landscape architect in that, and how do you feel that your thinking as a landscape architect, what does it bring in, compared also with the ideas and knowledge coming from architecture and the other disciplines in your office?
I think that since we are based with landscape architect and architect from day one, it was really important that this notion about where built structure meets landscape, meets the site, the context has been, I mean, it's in our skeleton, everybody working in Snøhetta. So I think that's more, and I think we're 50-50 men and women and maybe 30 different nationalities. And in a way, I think it's more important what you bring to the table, that actually then it doesn't matter. I mean, we don't have a landscape architect department. It's all mixed together. So it's really
but there are other landscape architects also in Snøhetta?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we always try to make a team from the start with all disciplines. Of course, it depends a little bit about the program, but there always an architect, a landscape architect, usually an interior architect, depends if it's only an outdoor landscape, but it doesn't really matter. It's what you bring to the table and how you start discuss. So we say that it's really important to be generous and not stop, really be in the green zone. There's no bad ideas, even of course there are bad ideas. I mean, we do competitions, we win 2 of 15, so we practice a lot. And then it's all about talking quite a lot and making a lot of models. So these discussions, I think, is important. And if there is one project that actually doesn't have a landscaper on board, always somebody says, why isn't there any landscape architects? But it's no problem that an architect are doing sort of landscape architect works. So I think we're really blurring those lines that are very much integrated, which doesn't seem that, okay, this is my work as a landscape architect, or that an interior architect, I know this is my work. I think that's maybe our biggest strength, that it's just totally the way it should be. So sometimes I really forget about, that's not the normal way, since we usually are doing our project internally. Sometimes interior and landscape architects do project with other offices, but the architects never do another project with another landscape architect or interior office, are very, very rare. So I think the notion of really that the team decides, so how we then set up the teams, how we actually pick the employees, that's all about sharing, and it's not my project or my idea, then I think also the depth of that, then we have the notion of time, that maybe landscape architecture is even better to understand, because we have to think about we're outdoor, and trees take a long time. So I think that is about how we teach each other internally to actually work together.
Okay, Marty, also you said that because you were reflecting on the different way of thinking, and you showed the cocktail in your office. There are biologists, people who really know a lot about plants, about natural processes. There are architects, there are landscape architects, and you reflected upon how do architects and landscape architects share time. You also mentioned this notion of thinking about time and the connection between time and space. So what do you think is the notion about time when we talk about the connection between architecture and landscapes, and how does time come into play?
I think that in practice, it very much depends of the mission. And there are missions that and I think a public space which is maybe a square, and the way the client asks you, you cannot, there's a lot of the margin, the percentage of freedom within the same mission. Time is not so open as it would be in a place where there's not so much intensity of use, and where there are many more natural processes. That's generally. But what I think in this, what makes fertile relations, I think it's expertise. So that's, for me, it's a very good fun to, when my practice, we are 5 permanent people, and then 3 more that comes and go. And it's 90% women. At the moment, I'm the only man. It's like this. But I really enjoy mixing, like cocktailing, making the nice cocktail according to the mission, and because there are projects that they are maybe more processual, and they are projects that they need more more definition in a way. But also, I think there is an expertise to it, and there is a moment, and maybe within a project, there's within the project life, I have the feeling that there's a moment where I really love the architects to be there. It's actually, I think our practices are very similar. It's just that basically we only do open space, but also with architects, and I guess you make more of buildings. But and to me, it's really about cocktailing according to the mission, and then also trying to force the mission, because the missions are, the people who make the missions have a lot of cliches, and then you have to work a bit. Like they ask you an opera, and you give them a square. Oh yeah, there's an opera behind, beyond, but you give them a huge, massive space. So it's about this idea of forcing a bit the brief in order to perhaps make a more open and more evolutive idea. Then you can bring the notion of time better. Or maybe you have to explain why you are not defining more, because with clients, they want to control. The wall is full of control freaks. It's the normal thing is that you are in a control freak situation where and you are supposed in 3 weeks or 3 months or 6 months to control it all and to make the client happy. And it's very hard sometimes to say maybe it's not a good idea to control it all.
Yeah. So I think what was also impressive, Jenny, when you showed this conceptual idea of, for example, the opera house. It's really connected with the large landscape, with the topography, with the geography, with the hillscape, and you find an image that somehow connects this building with not only the soils but also the wide landscape. How do you perceive that the people, when you design a building like this, does this enable also the people to experience that this becomes again part of the larger landscape? This building, because you showed before that there were many separations, there was the big street, there was the hard shores, and now your building becomes somehow a connecting element. how did you get any reflections on how people actually feel? Because we have another session later, which is about the experience of moving through these spaces. And quite clearly, this opera house has a totally different way of making people move through the city and experiencing then this building becoming a part of the landscape again, rather than standing inside or outside. So how do you perceive this notion of experience? How would it change the feeling of people when experience an architecture that is developed in this way?
The really interesting thing was that in the brief of the competition, they didn't ask for a public plaza at all. It was only a building, which is of course terrible. I mean, there is a site, but there is always something to the site. It has to be connected relation to something. So that was really very early our thought that we wanted to make the extra. And I think specifically when you are that close to water, and the horizon will always be very important. So when you're making something sliding that is actually not on horizontal, then you sort of turn out of a building and into a landscape in a very easy way to translate it back. And since so many people actually were against it, then to try to attract people to go on top of the opera. And we didn't really expect that so many would like it, and the client absolutely not. So it was a lot of people that was against it, and then they started to walk on top of it and liked it. And it was a different experience, and it's also like an experience that you are walking in a landscape, because you have to look down, because it's pretty steep, you can trip, which everything else in a lot of urban spaces, it's so programmed. You should watch there, you should sit here, you should throw away a litter there, so it's over-programmed. So that was maybe the best thing about that it was nobody that asked for a public plaza, that it was a non-programmed space. And I think that relates straight back to a landscape. Nature is never programmed, which we as people always do, and it's a lot of times it's over-programmed because space is so crucial that we have to make sure that every square centimeters has a purpose in a way. And then to make something that is vast, that it looks bigger than maybe any other part of it, and again try to connect to the ocean and to the green structure around in a much bigger picture, you also start to look different because it's sloping. You have to change your site, and you are walking in a lot of different slopes, which you also do in a landscape. So maybe that notion of moving around in a city where you usually have maybe facades on two sides, you come to a square, it opens up, but still you have the room. Here it was sort of a surface with a bigger picture around it. So in a way, it's, I mean, you can't really do anything. You're just out walking and looking. And maybe that's a relief for more people, that nobody's really expecting you. You can walk inside the building, and a lot of people do, but you don't have to. And I think also the notion of a place you don't have to buy anything. It's free. It's part of the right to be in the public realm, and it's free for everybody. You can do whatever you want. Also make people use the space differently. You can sit down, you don't have to. You can run, but you don't have to. You can walk into the water. It can be scary. It can be risk-taking. And it's all about what you want to explore yourself.
So this kind of undetermined space that gives you kind of freedom while you're in the middle of the city to do many things. And at the same time, what I also like, this notion of space as a temporal perception. Because there are events that you showed where the space can get very crowded. Then in the wintertime, the ice and the snow almost make the water service and the building be connected. And Marty, also you reflected very much on how actually what it is that we actually design with living elements. It's not that we only design like buildings, But everything that is connected with the natural environment, of course, it is affected by many influences, by the weather, by the seasons, by the people themselves who are agents of an ecological system themselves. So and I think, Marty, it was great how you presented these two different ways of how to design this kind of space as a temporal phenomena, because we are kind of designing an interaction between different elements. It's not so much that we are only designing a form, but we need to perceive these different ways how a space changes through us using it, but through many other elements having an influence. So what does that mean in terms of the role of the designer?
I first want to make a reflection, then I'll try to answer. I think something that should come out of making cocktails is it's this hybrid character that you were asking right at the beginning, and the notion of multifunctionality or undetermined spaces. So, and the long L why would you have only an opera if you can have an opera which is a belvedere, which is a square, which is three operas, because in fact you have the inner space and the roof space. So for me, what makes sense about teaming up architects and landscape architects, it's creating hybrids. That's the whole and this idea of multifunctionality, and then actually answering more the question you make to her, because I had more time to reflect upon. I think, to me, it's this notion of the feeling of you walking and being in a landscape or in a project or in. I think we really enjoy making projects on photography, directly in photography. Sometimes when you work with landscape, you don't have to transform it all. You just have to transform a little. So this idea of the design being conceived in perspective, really like you with your human scale, it is, to us, is very relevant. But also, it's that we try to make as many different kinds of drawing as possible. So we are not strong in digital, that's not our, but also we don't make very complex objects, that's the reality. But it's very important to us to work on the photography, but then make cross sections, but then make diagrams. And the more drawings you make, the double check, the triple, and then and to me this is how we try to incorporate this idea of the experiential into the and then in the comparison of the two ways of making projects. I'm not sure if I make it clear, is that maybe 60% of the time happens on site in certain projects. And I think that it's a permanent revision of your ideas by being on site, and also being, for instance, now we have this light that comes through a kind of a foggy place. No, I don't have this light at home. Our light is completely different. So how would I make a project here? I don't know. No, so this idea of paying attention because you are outside, because you are feeling it, or because you look at photos, but not photos of the day you went. No, photos of the 15 days you went, and then give you a kind of a palette of things you can use in your project. So I put a couple of images where there were steams and there were a nice light. This is obviously I don't move the sun, but you can play with it. And that's how I mean the experiential is this idea that I think, at least in the landscape world, there are too many hours spent in practice. That's my feeling.
Okay. To finalize our session, of course, we also want to give the opportunity and open up for some dialogue on either reflections or questions to our invited guests on this relationship between architecture and landscape. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question or give a comment on this topic?
How much, when you designed the opera, was anticipated what would happen outside? Was it that because you showed a picture of a concert, was that something you thought would happen, or was it just something that you let happen after a while? And where you said like many spaces are over-programmed. How much did you program in the beginning, and how much did you just let happen?
We didn't program anything. We really wanted it to be one open space, but it has some kinks. It was actually 3 artists, 1 architect and 1 landscape architect, that worked on the whole process to do the project. Of course, in a dialogue with the opera, that how this 24/7 open urban space would work, and we were like, yes, we really believe in it, that people will come, and they were, yeah, okay. The most important is actually to let them go inside the building, but of course, nice that they also can walk on top of it. So there was very early discussion about that actually they could be used as concerts, but not really planned. And I think they saw the opportunity very early, and actually, since the whole project was finished 6 months ahead of time of the schedule, it was open half a year early, and we opened it up. So one of the pictures I showed was actually in the construction process. And then it was one day open, and it was thousands of people that walked over it. And then there were 2 that was falling over, tripping. And I think 1 broke his arm or something like that. And then, of course, there was almost hysterical. We said, come on, it's not safe. It could be too slippery. People don't watch their step. And then there was a big discussion on how to actually relate that to have contrast colors, so you can actually see there's a step. So this was more of the discussion than actually program it. And in the end, we managed to get away from the whole contrast color thing, because we define all the kinks as art. And we say that the rest of the sloping areas were actually urban plaza. So I think that evolves over time. It's actually used quite a lot for TV concerts and programs. During summer, I think it's every Saturday, they have a big show, a floating stage in the water, and then people sit, and then you have to bring your own whatever you want to sit on, if you want to sit on just a carpet or bring a chair. So this is really, some of them are actually you have to pay for, but most of them are free. So of course this is a discussion about how do we do with litter, I mean, when you throw away things. So there has been set up litter places so you actually can get rid of that, but not anything else actually to occupy it. Very early, people also, they were very concerned that you could get snow blind because it's so white. And we thought that was hysterical. But then there was a couple of people that set up a business to start to sell shades to make sure it wasn't too. So we have had other discussions that actually how to use the space. But suddenly then people had made a business, and somebody of course wanted to maybe sell food. We said that is not allowed on top of the roof. But it's really open 24/7. And I think that's maybe the most important. And then, no, actually this week it has been open for 10 years. So then also, of course, I'm sure there will be new ways of using it over time. So I'm sure there will be different things that will happen after people come up with new ideas.
Yes, I have a question to both of you. In the projects that you showed, a certain like deep understanding for the landscape that you're working with became visible, like sort of familiarity with the 2 landscapes of Northern and Southern Europe that you presented. How much familiarity do you need for this kind of work that you're doing between architecture and landscape? How do you gain this kind of familiarity, or what do you do if you don't have no knowledge or familiarity with landscape at all? If you enter a landscape which is totally different, radically new from what you know in Mediterranean context or Northern European context, that would be a question. But I would be interested to have your comment on. Maybe I'm wrong also with assuming that there is this notion of familiarity or intimacy or knowledge, which you need a long time to grow
I think it's a very clever question, because in fact, uh, by doing project in different landscapes, I think there is a kind of a thinner eye, if you want, a thinner eye to try to identify what makes a difference in terms of materiality, for instance, or in terms of processes. In my particular case, Catalonia has Pyrenees, has almost desert, so in a very micro, small place, you can already identify very different vegetation, very different mountains, and so you kind of train on that. But it's true that the more, for instance, I work in my own hometown, I need to do less. The less I know about the project, I kind of try to do more things. And that it doesn't stop me to work in other countries, I must say.
I think it's so important to be on site, like Marty says, to actually have the possibility to go on site. We're doing tons of competitions, and of course we cannot always go to the site before we make it. And then of course there's Google Earth, but to be there, to feel and touch is so important. And maybe landscape architects are more into the soil, to actually touch and feel on the actual site, but I think that's also personal what you usually do. And I think sometimes it's really good that you know a place very well, and sometimes you can get home blind, that you don't really see. So it's good to actually come from the outside, like working in Middle East, in the desert landscape, we can totally misunderstand, but maybe we find something different. And I think there's always this way of try to maybe subtract or make this one thing that is very important for the concept and try to relate it back. We work a lot with past, present, and future, which we talked about in the early, before we started. And I think that always go back in the layers you do on a site. So that's why when I say landscape, I also really mean site and context. And it's so many layers that needs to be worked on together. I don't know if it really answered your question, but it's really important.
I would like to ask something. There is a kind of a beauty, that's my thought. That's not an answer, it's my thought. A beauty in austerity. But that very much depends on the program you are asked to do. So if you are asked to do a house, it's obvious that you will seriously transform the space. If you are asked to make a path, then the program, it would be very not serious to have a one answer. But I think there is this beauty in these projects that with very little things they manage to, and also with very little resources. So at least for me, and also it's a condition in the south that we are fucking precarious. So there's no money. So it's no question normally to and make most out of it.
Okay, so as the time is now over with 1 hour for every session, the idea is then we're now going into the next session. Of course, we can still relate back to the notions of architecture and landscape when discussing the other topics. And now we will move into the next session discussing the relationship between architecture and city. Christoph, I will hand over to you to introduce the topic, and everybody will stay around the whole day, so you are all welcome also in the break to continue these discussions. Christoph.
Thank you, Antje.